You're listening to an episode of What on Earth is Going On? This show was originally broadcast on the radio at CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. It is now available to you in this format with all spoken content unabridged. For more information, visit wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Good evening. You are listening to CFRC, broadcast in the Kingston area at 101.9 FM and streaming live at cfrc.ca. My name is Ben. Welcome to What on Earth is Going On? Every Thursday at 6 p.m., we take you beneath the headlines to identify the events, the characters, the forces, and the ideas that shape the human story today. We ask why things are happening, how they might have come to be, and where we might all be headed. If you have any questions or want to contribute to the ongoing discussion, please get in touch. You can find the show online at www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. There you can listen to this episode and others in podcast form and also link up through social media. I would love to hear your thoughts. Tonight, we're talking once again about Karl Marx in the second of two parts. We will be joined, just as last week, by Queen's Professor of Sociology, Rob Beamish, and we'll be digging into how interpretations of Marx's thoughts and ideas changed after his life and can be used as a lens through which to understand our world today. But before we get to Marx, here's an item in the news that you might have missed. Early last month, there was an election in Hungary which returned the right-wing populist Prime Minister Viktor Orbán to power. Orbán proclaims himself and his government as illiberal, and he has railed against immigration and the European Union, of which Hungary is a part. Orbán presents a dire threat to the European project of unity and economic integration, so much so that other leaders on the continent have given him significant leeway to move his country away from basic norms of democracy such as free press and human rights, for fear of the consequences if they confront him. Not surprisingly, some have called this behavior appeasement, reminiscent of the way Britain and France approached and emboldened Hitler's Germany prior to the Second World War. At the eye of this particular storm is the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary's capital. A bastion of free thought, academic dialogue, and intellectual inquiry right in the heart of Europe, the university has long been a target of Orbán and his government. He sees the internationally oriented school as a hotbed of undemocratic global elites who, among other things, are trying to justify immigration into Hungary and thus the watering down of Hungarian ethnicity and culture. Strengthened by his election victory, Viktor Orbán has put the university into legal limbo. The institution does not yet know if it will be allowed to operate legally when the 2019 school year commences. Canadians may recognize the rector of the Central European University, Michael Ignatieff, former leader of the Federal Liberal Party. Ignatieff said recently that the university might just want to get out of Budapest and Hungary altogether, perhaps to Austria. Some argue that Hungary would lose a big economic driver if the university does skip town, but Viktor Orbán is more likely to say good riddance and claim victory, appealing to nationalists and populists who think that their country will do just fine without English-speaking students and high-paid snobby scholars. But if you believe that a dynamic public discourse is critical for a well-functioning open society, then surely the departure of such a renowned center of study is a defeat for progress wherever it may happen. As of this recording, the university remains in limbo and has not decided if it will have to leave. But whether or not it goes, Hungary is a key place to watch as we try to understand what on earth is going on. But anyways, enough with that heavy stuff. Let's get to Karl Marx. Dr. Rob Beamish is a professor at Queen's University in Kingston. In 1992, he wrote Marx, Method, and the Division of Labor. After serving as the head of the Department of Sociology, Professor Beamish has since returned to work on projects related to the development of Marx's ideas. Keep your eyes peeled for when his work hits the shelves. I'm sure that it will be worth the read. Professor Beamish, thanks so much for coming to talk with me once more.
Oh, yeah, I'm more than happy to be here.
Thank you. So last week, we talked quite a bit about Marx's life as well as his key ideas in the 19th century, just as the industrial age was kicking off worldwide. We tried to separate Marx from Marxism and how his own theories changed throughout his life. I'd like to start today off by asking how his theories changed after his life, how they have been interpreted by others, and what systems of thought and government have arisen from Marx, even if they weren't exactly what he had in mind. So when we look at the 20th century through Marx, a century that Eric Hobsbawm called the Age of Extremes, what on earth is going on?
Okay, that's a pretty deep question, and so it'll give us lots to chat about today, I think. The first thing that I guess I should emphasize is that Marx's work is interpreted in different ways, partly because he never really did finish his entire intellectual project. Early in, 1857-58, when he wrote his outlines of his critique of political economy, at that point, his plan was to do first a book on capital, second a book on landed property, third a book on wage labor, fourth a book on the state, and fifth a book on the world market. Wow. So in a sense then, he was following the kind of outline that early political economists had done in terms of defining a class structure around capital, landed property, wage labor, and then the involvement of the state, and then globalization or the world market. As Marx explored political economy, and as we sort of mentioned last week, got drawn down into the rabbit hole of political economy, he continually pursued minute questions around the dynamics of capitalist society. So looking at capital, the capitalist production process, which was Volume 1, the circulation process, which was intended to be Volume 2, that he only left in a series of manuscripts, and then Volume 3, which again he left in a series of manuscripts that Engels later published, looking at production and consumption, or production and circulation together as a unit. In doing that then, what Marx did was focused on the structure of capitalism. And so many people then thought, well, what Marx has done is he's discovered the objective laws of the movement of capital. Mm-hmm. And of course, that idea is reinforced a little bit by reading the Communist Manifesto. When you read the manifesto, Marx there, in many ways, kind of sets out what's often interpreted as an internal dialectic to the movement of capital that would lead to its own self-destruction. So Marx's manuscripts then, Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3, as Volumes 2 and Volume 3 are published by Engels towards the end of the 19th century, lead to this question of, is there an inevitable breakdown to capitalist society? And so scholars like Rosa Luxemburg then start to explore capitalism in the early phases of the 20th century, trying to see if there is, and it became the so-called breakdown controversy, whether there is the inevitable breakdown of capitalism following these particular laws. What that did then was led to, a kind of a reassessment of Marx's work. So one strong interpretation that emerges out of that will lead ultimately to what will be defined as a structuralist tradition within French political thought, mostly associated with the work of Louis Althusser and Nicolas Poulantzas. And in that, the idea is that Marx has discovered the scientific laws underlying the breakdown of capitalist society. Mm-hmm. Others, Georg Lukács writes a really influential set of essays called History and Class Consciousness. And in History and Class Consciousness, what Lukács does is, in a sense, goes back to the earlier works of Marx, although the Paris manuscripts hadn't been published by then, but sort of rediscovers, number one, the Hegelian dimension to Marx's work, but secondly, and more important, that the manifesto is not just a study of the objective laws of capital, it's also a study of the formation of the proletariat as a class-conscious entity that will lobby for and ultimately foment revolution that will change the world. Mm-hmm. So in History and Class Consciousness, what Lukács argues there is that the actual working conditions of workers, the sort of sweatshop work that was being performed at the end of the 19th century and even in the early stages of the 20th century would lead to so much sense of dissatisfaction, probably immiseration, certainly relative deprivation. In other words, capital would begin to gain larger and larger profits. A capitalist class would become very wealthy. A working class would become more and more numerous, but also more and more impoverished, or at least relative to the capitalist class. And that would lead then to dissatisfaction. So Lukasz's idea was sort of like drawing from Marx's Capital, looking at what are the internal contradictions of the system, what sort of stresses and strains do they create, and how will working class individuals respond to those. So when Marx writes in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeoisie is creating its own gravediggers as it brings more and more workers into larger and larger manufacturing entities, it's creating a class that will become politically conscious. And that political consciousness, he argued, would lead then to some sort of revolutionary activity.
So just to pause for a moment, is this what Marx is talking about when he defines history as class struggle?
Yeah, so the idea of class struggle is, I think, a fairly complex one, mainly because Marx deals with class and class struggle in different ways in different texts. So one of the things that I think I mentioned last week was it's really important to know what Marx has said, when he said it, and what the context is. The reason why I'm mentioning that is, again, when you read the manifesto, most people see the manifesto as a document that portrays, what I call the two great titans, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat.
Right.
And it is a simple, or it seems to be a simple two-class model. Now, in fact, as you read through the manifesto, you can recognize that he's talking about the gradual movement towards these two great titans, but there are certainly intermediary classes even within the manifesto. Nevertheless, the idea that's drawn from that in popularizations as well as in some scholarly work is what you have is a two-class model where you'll have this struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie. And that struggle is seen to be most often tied to the objective circumstances of capital accumulation, capital exploitation, and the labor process. What Lukács and then later Karl Marx did was they sort of reinserted and re-emphasized Marx's idea that there is a subjective consciousness that matters here. At the same time, the reason why I mention you need to sort of understand where Marx is writing and what he's writing is that in much of his historical work, so the class struggles in France, the 18th premiere of Napoleon Bonaparte, you can see there that he has a very complex image of the class structure of France in the 19th century. So he is very aware that the class dynamics, different class fractions will form alliances, and so there's nothing that is inevitable, I don't think, in Marx's historical work about the direction of capitalist society unless particular forms of consciousness come into being.
What is class? And I'm going to just preface this by saying I lived in the UK for a number of years, and in that country, people are much more aware of class, what it is, how they fit into it, than they are, say, in Canada or North America at large. And so when we say class, what are we talking about, and how is it different from things such as ethnicity or income or employment? What is class?
Okay, good question. So again, I'm just going to, go back to Marx's text for a moment, that in his original plan of sort of writing out that whole project, dealing with capital and then dealing with landed property and then dealing with wage labor, in a sense, there is a certain amount of debate around the missing book on wage labor. And in fact, it's at the end of what becomes the manuscript for Volume 3 that Marx finally has a small section on what class is. I mention all of that because, the idea of class there breaks off. But really, I think most scholars of Marx's work and most class analysts would argue that class involves two significant dimensions. The first one would be what are often referred to as the objective dimensions. And in the production process, the circulation process, what Marx points out is that, capitalists aren't evil individuals in and of themselves. They are compelled by the particular mode of production, capitalist production, to behave in particular ways if they want to remain capitalists. They need to exploit workers. They need to generate a profit. They need to try to get more production out of a shorter and shorter work day, or to continue workers working longer and longer hours.
Okay.
So it's part of kind of their objective circumstances.
Right.
And Marx also argues the same sort of objective circumstances, but from a very different aspect, exist for workers. So what Marx is setting up in Volume 1 of Capital and Volume 2 is this dialectic of two different dynamics that are going to play themselves out within the development of capitalist society. The second aspect then becomes the work of Lukács, Korsch, and others, going back to the manifesto and saying, well, class involves a subjective appreciation of the world in which we live. That the working class has to become politically mobilized. So class also involves a subjective dimension. And that then gets to the question that you've asked, and that is, so I grew up in the UK, and in the UK, people are very aware of class circumstance, whereas when you come to North America, there's not nearly the same awareness.
But it still exists even if you're not aware of it.
Yeah, exactly. But the awareness, I think, is that within the UK, number one, there is a long history of class struggle, I guess, class identification, that I'm not able to do this, but you certainly would be able to. When you meet someone and talk to them, you have a sense from their accent of where they come from in England, and probably what sort of status they would have within England. Whereas in Canada, it's more difficult to do that. You can get a sense of regional dialect, I suppose, regional accent, but the idea of class accent I don't think really exists here. And part of that is because we haven't had the same history of limited opportunity that extends back in history in the UK for several hundred years. And also that the generation that I grew up in, the generation even that you grew up in, we grew up in a generation where there was the establishment of mass production, mass consumption, and so the shift in identity, the shift in subjective awareness shifts away from what is it that you do at work to what is it that you consume, what is it that you do in your leisure time. And throughout that golden age that Hobsbawm identified from 1945 into the 1970s, real wages were expanding, consumer goods were becoming more and more available, people identified themselves through their patterns of consumption. When you move into the 1970s and onwards, then you can start to see very slowly and imperceptibly the concentration of capital into increasingly larger and larger enterprises that create, in some senses, not monopolies perhaps, but certainly oligopolies. And oligopolies then have a great deal of power, both economically but also politically. And so they're able to influence policies that make unionization difficult or make it difficult for consumers to complain about the products that they're receiving. And so you have then a dynamic that slowly but surely creates a class structure that we may not be consciously aware of on a daily basis, but certainly has created a dynamic where there's way more economic and political power in the hands of several large multinational corporations that certainly is far greater than what an electorate would have in voting different governments into power.
Well, and there are groups of people, the 1% of the 1%, so to speak, the billionaires of the world, who have captured a lot of this capital and become the super rich of our world and are becoming more and more so. And economists like Thomas Piketty in France, with his book Capital in the 21st Century, argues that the rate of return on capital is greater than the rate of return from wage earnings and labor, which is a kind of a critical piece of the puzzle that explains why inequality is growing. But a lot of people, it seems, still struggle with why that golden age between 45 and 73 in the 20th century, why that happened, and if it's possible, I guess, to go back to that, if it's possible to re-engineer that scenario, or is Marx right? Is capitalism doomed to its own destruction?
Okay, so in some ways, ways, what Piketty points out, and there have been other researchers as well, is showing that the amount of income or wealth that's being accrued by the top 1% or the top 0.01% is enormous. So you can see their wealth, if you look at a graph, the graph goes fairly level with a slight incline all the way until you get to the top 1%, and then it starts to grow, and and it grows, as you mentioned, exponentially after that. So the people who are in that longer level off graph, what they see in terms of relative deprivation is they can see their neighbors, they can see themselves, they know what their relatives across Canada, what their experiences are like, and so they don't directly see this enormous concentration of wealth, except when you look at what's going on, I guess, in Hollywood, where you get ideas of glamour, etc. So I think that this dynamic within capitalist society is creating huge wealth amongst the top 1 or 0.01%, but the rest of the population is not really sure of where does that wealth come from? Does it really exist? My circumstances seem to be okay, although I know that my daily costs are increasing. Inflation is staying, ahead of, and sometimes well ahead of what my wages are. Right. And so there is a sense of dissatisfaction. But where to direct that dissatisfaction, I think, is really unknown. Which really gives then people like Donald Trump the opportunity to sort of say, let's make America great again. Let's go back to the 1950s.
Right.
So that's the image. The image is, if I bring back industrial production, then everything will be great. But what he's doing, of course, is he draws voters to support him, but all of the legislation that he's passing is helping the rich and the super rich. Right. So all the tax breaks, it will put, $600 in your pocket, if you're a middle class wage earner in the United States over the course of a year, and that's real money. Well, it's putting, millions of dollars into the bankrolls of the super rich. But individuals thinking, well, he's come through on the promise, he's given us our $600, and he's lowering tax rates, and my income tax is going down, and he's getting rid of this big inefficient government structure, which in the 1980s proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that government can't actually be involved constructively in the economy.
And yet the sense that something is wrong, that slowly but surely the earnings that people are making from their wages and from their McJobs, you could call them, this very precarious labor, that the earnings they're making from that is slowly but surely less and less enough to meet their ends, while the very rich, the corporations, for example, during the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, did better, and CEOs got paid even more, even while their companies were seeming to go under. And people see this contradiction, and perhaps maybe because they aren't aware of the deeper forces at play, they vote for someone like Donald Trump, who promises to correct it and make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And Trump has the advantage of really almost 25 years of neoliberal ideology that has permeated, the electorate. In some ways, Mike Harris, with his Common Sense Revolution, captures in very simple terms, what's going on. And what's going on, he argues, is government is inefficient, and we need to make government smaller. We need to return tax money to the consumers' pockets, and by consumers spending their money, then that will lead to the revitalization of the economy. And as the economy revitalizes, just like in the 1950s, then we will all the boats will rise down with the tide.
If it trickles down enough, the tide will go up.
That's right. Yeah.
It's interesting because, we have Doug Ford now running for the premier in Ontario, and some of the similar language is being used, especially common sense for the people and attacking wasteful spending by the elite government, and that we just need government to be smaller, even though he's committed to not firing a single public servant, and of course seems to promise all of this spending and nowhere for it to come from. I don't mean for this to become too topical, but what I'm saying is that there seems to be this sort of elasticity between how we deal with these problems, when it's so obvious and in our face that something is wrong and that things seem to be getting worse as people get more and more unequal. And Karl Marx argued that in the end, capitalism would destroy itself. And I just wanted to ask it a question that I've had for a long time, and I've never actually been able to get a good answer to it. And so here's your challenge, which is that, is it a moral hazard for Marxists or anyone who is an advocate for Marx's ideas to say that capitalism is eventually going to destroy itself, so I shouldn't have to do anything? If I'm a member of the proletariat who should one day become the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's not really up to me to do anything. I should just wait until it destroys itself. In fact, I should encourage capitalism to put the pedal to the metal, so to speak, go as fast as you can, privatize everything, to hasten its own demise. Is that a moral hazard, or is that actually what Marx had in mind?
Okay, I think it's a moral hazard, and I don't really think it's ever what Marx had in mind. And I don't think that for several reasons. So one, I'll just point out historically. And I think I mentioned George Lichtheim's History of Marxism last week. But in Lichtheim's History of Marxism, what he argues is that when Marx was writing the Manifesto in 1848, he was still really influenced by French revolutionary thought. And so he really did think there would be, and given the conditions that he saw around him in Paris and saw around him ultimately in London and Manchester, there was a good reason for socialists and communists to believe that this system can't go on for very long. Just too much misery and exploitation. It's going to break up. By the time you get to 1871, Lichtheim argues that by then Marx recognizes that it is a political process, and so the formation of the Workers' International, he becomes highly involved in that, and his idea of change then becomes, perhaps there will be revolution, but perhaps there will be some sort of evolutionary process towards creating what would be revolutionary change without some sort of armed insurrection.
Right.
And so when you look at kind of the history of labor legislation within the UK, which Marx documents pretty extensively in Capital, you can see reforms. So then the question becomes really between the sort of revolutionary Marxists and the revisionists. Who is right? That ultimately capitalism will break down. So that breakdown controversy was to try to explore, is there an inevitable breakdown? Will capitalism ultimately undo itself? Or, as the revisionists were arguing, well, the world has changed a lot since 1848. It's changed a lot since 1867. And what we need to do is start to become more active politically to raise the consciousness of social democrats who would then form political movements, political parties that would create change. And those changes would ultimately lead to a much better condition of life for everyone.
Well, it's interesting because many have argued that communism actually achieved its purposes by being a threat rather than by being in power. That the very threat of communism or socialism in the 19th century, and then, of course, in the 20th century with the rise of the Soviet Union, Maoist China, that the threat of those regimes encouraged and in a way forced Western countries, liberal democracies, to enact major social reforms, to bring in unemployment benefits, to bring in social spending, and essentially the modern redistributive power of the state in order to correct these contradictions, even without necessarily resolving them. And then you could almost argue that if that continues, perhaps capitalism will resolve these contradictions simply by evolving over time in sort of a thesis, antithesis, synthesis of Hegel.
Yeah, in terms of that, I guess one of the things that I'll just add into that is you're absolutely right, I think, that the presence of the Soviet Union really did influence social and public policy and military policy within the West.
Right.
And so there were, I think, lots of concessions made to workers in that golden age in order to keep the working class on side. At the same time, and again, people aren't perhaps as aware of this as perhaps they should be, but France was a key state in the post-war period insofar as the resistance movement was largely made up of communists and socialists. And the reason for that was that the communists and socialists already had their underground cells. And so when France was occupied, they were in a position to be able to communicate with each other to create resistance. I mention that because at the end of the Second World War, when France is liberated, the fear in the U.S. and England is that a free election within France could lead to the election of a socialist government. And so they did a great deal to support Charles de Gaulle. I mean, one of the reasons the Americans became involved in Vietnam was to support the French desire to, retake over their colony in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So the fear was, and I'm only make this point to reinforce what you've already said, the fear was then that we need to keep the Iron Curtain where it is because there are potentials within liberal democracies for liberal democratic governments to elect socialists and maybe even communists to power. So that's why I think you see a number of concessions that are made to making it easier for workers to unionize, as well as legislation that helps unions. Then the other aspect to all of this is that in that golden age, as the United States, Canada were rebuilding Western Europe, there was a tremendous amount of production, and so there was continual job creation. Yeah. So even now, England in some ways becomes kind of the lone country here because within Germany, the amount of money that was invested in the Marshall Plan into West Germany, particularly West Germany, because they wanted to show West Germany as a beacon. The beacon, for liberal democracies, whereas the Soviets did pretty much the same within East Germany, although really they just focused on East Berlin, and even there it wasn't very well done. But the amount of money that went into the Marshall Plan to rebuild West Germany created jobs in a nation that had been totally devastated. Whereas in England, no money went into England for the Marshall Plan, and so England kind of had to recover from the war effort, on its own. Now, Keynes is able, I think, to introduce economic policy that's picked up by labor governments that do involve governments becoming involved in trying to stimulate the economy. And so in that whole period as the Western Europe is being rebuilt, jobs are plentiful, incomes can rise, and the working circumstances, the dynamic of the economy is one of growth, which is way different than the period when Marx was writing, much more dynamic growth in the golden age than had existed there. But then that all starts to slow, and that then leads to debates around public policy, and that ultimately leads to the rise of a neoliberal ideology which removes state involvement. And as I've sort of mentioned earlier, it's in that period of the golden age where you start seeing the growth of large integrated multinational corporations, and those large integrated multinational corporations become increasingly multinational, moving their headquarters to areas where they can have tax havens. So the amount of money that is generated and then harbored by economic elites becomes enormous.
I've read before that Marx and Engels back in the 19th century, when they were writing and working together, were actually quite fond of many ideas that we would call liberal today, whether that's human rights or the emancipation of the individual, for example. So Hegel's idea that if one person is in chains, all of us are imprisoned, and all of us cannot be free until every single one of us is free, and Marx actually rode with that, and that's quite a liberal idea, the freedom of the individual. But we have to position that against how many regimes in the 20th century have interpreted Karl Marx's ideas. And I think it's before we talk further about Marx and today, I think we need to get a grasp on these regimes of the 20th century and how they interpreted Marx's ideas. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, Vietnam, Cuba, for example. Maybe these are all coming from the same ilk, but what was their take on Marx, even if it was a contradiction?
Okay, so I think the place to start would be with the Soviet Union and with Lenin. So in a sense, Lukash's idea that workers working within the production process within capitalist society will be immiserated, exploited, and there will be a growing political consciousness among them, and they will ultimately move to some sort of revolutionary demands. What Lenin argued was that what that experience will do is it will build what he called trade union consciousness, but won't build revolutionary consciousness. That it will encourage workers to form trade unions, and then trade unions will struggle with the state to try to improve working conditions. Whereas Lenin said, really what you need is a vanguard party, a vanguard elite that is knowing, more knowledgeable than workers themselves, to create the vanguard that will lead the revolution. So when Lenin and the Soviet Union, or excuse me, the Soviet Revolution takes place, and Lenin is able ultimately to rise to power, he has put in place a particular state. And in some ways, in the manifesto, Marx talks about. Not in the manifesto, in a letter to Joseph Wedemeyer, he says, I didn't discover classes. Bourgeois historians discovered classes long before me, and bourgeois political economists outlined their dynamic. What I did was I discovered that, the historical existence of classes, and that class struggle would lead to what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which would ultimately then lead to a classless society. So this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat is an intermediary stage between capitalism and a classless society.
Right.
So when Lenin starts talking about a vanguard party, he's able to say, so what we're doing is we're establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, which really meant the dictatorship of the Communist Party. And then that, when Lenin dies, Stalin takes over. It's even more consolidated into, a pretty ruthless dictatorship in which, millions of Ukrainians die through, a created famine. People are put into the gulag. And so Stalin, really does consolidate power around what becomes a political class, a privileged political class. So that dictatorship of the proletariat becomes the dictatorship of the Bolshevik Party, which then favors certain individuals to the cost of everybody else. At the same time, you have the emergence of the Cold War. And so rather than Stalin and the Bolsheviks investing he did invest a great deal in industrializing the Soviet Union rapidly. And again, his idea of being Stalin steel, the production of steel was for him symbolic of the power of the state. So they did invest a lot in industrialization, took over the ideas of Ford, set up assembly line production, etc. But also, he created a powerful army. Now, he created that powerful army partly, again, because of the Second World War experience, where Germany moved into the Soviet Union pretty quickly, created huge sieges, and, the cost in human lives of Soviets in what they refer to as the Great War was enormous, far greater than what anybody in the West experienced, despite all of the tragedies in the West. So the idea then of having an impregnable military state means that investment goes into guns as opposed to butter. And so what Stalin does is, rather than meeting the consumer needs of the population, really keeps that at a minimum in order to build a strong centralized state. And of course, then you need to keep control of that. And so you almost create the circumstances where the state continues to control the population in ways that, were totally antithetic to what Marx had ever thought, and even more exploitative than what you'd see within Western Europe or North America.
I wonder if we can ask the reverse question of what we asked before, which is that did the threat of communism encourage countries in the West to concede certain things, whether the states in the West to concede social programs or welfare or unemployment benefits or whatever? Did equally the same threat of capitalism force the hand of the Soviet state or the Maoist state in China to certain concessions? And I'm thinking specifically of Lenin's new economic plan in the 1920s, but were there other concessions because they thought capitalism is going to win the day unless we kind of give some ground here, or were they much more ideologically pure?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I honestly don't know enough about everyday life within the Soviet Union to make too informed a comment on that. Although I certainly do think that what Stalin was worried about was the power of capitalism, and he wanted to ensure that he had the best defenses possible.
Right.
So one of those was the Americans had used the atomic bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I think Stalin was suspect enough of the West to believe that he also had to have a nuclear weapon. So just as the Americans and the British took scientists out of Germany when in the post-war period, the Soviets did the same. And so launching their own nuclear program is a very huge endeavor for a developing nation. And so I think that Stalin was willing to force the sacrifice of everyday workers in order to build the defense that he thought would make the Soviet Union impregnable.
Well, and he wasn't entirely wrong. I mean, there were many American strategic thinkers in the 1940s after the war who argued to go to war right now with the Soviet Union while you still have the advantage. I mean, if we assume that there's going to be a clash between these two ideological superpowers, then we might as well have the clash when it's on our terms, when we have nuclear weapons and they don't. And so, I mean, although it was a horrific thing to imagine nuclear war, Stalin wasn't entirely wrong from a perspective of self-defense to do that.
Yeah, and certainly Winston Churchill. So in the final volume of his History of the Second World War, one of the things he points out is when the war in Europe is over, there's great celebration in London. And as he looks out at the Londoners celebrating, on the one hand, he understands the joy that creates, but he also has the dramatic fear that he outlines actually quite graphically, that the Americans will now retreat from Western Europe. And as they retreat from Western Europe and move back to North America, because there's no main interest for them staying, that then creates a vacuum that Stalin will move into. And so Churchill actually lobbied fairly stridently to do exactly what you've said, and that is continue the war into the Soviet Union and prevent Stalin or Lenin from staying in power, and Stalin from staying in power, and establish some sort of liberal democratic traditions there.
And Churchill settled for instead the Iron Curtain, which I believe is a term that he coined.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I'm gonna segue us now into the present.
Yeah.
And I've got a question which should take us into the end of our time, which is the show focuses a lot on story. What is the human story today? And the question I want to ask is if I am a person living today, which I am, and I look at the world around me as a member of a certain class, living in Canada, living in the West in 2018 with all of the crazy things that are happening, and I don't have Marx, how do I view the world in terms of political economy? And then the second question will be, if I add Marx to it, how does my perspective of the world change? And I'm talking about the narrative of our existence. What is the story without Marx, and then what is the story with Marx of our present world?
Okay, so to answer that question, let me just set it up a little bit. So C. Wright Mills writes a book called The Sociological Imagination. And in the sociological imagination, what he points out is 1959, but the same would be true today, that there's a malaise in the world, that people are uncertain of things. And he says most people see these as what he calls personal troubles of milieu. So as you look around and you see your neighbor is getting ahead economically faster than you, then that becomes a personal trouble. And you believe that the solution to a personal trouble is within your own power. It's within your own orbit. But Mills argues that in fact when one person sees that they're falling behind, that's a personal trouble. But when hundreds and then thousands of people see their incomes dying or slowly declining as inflation increases, then that's a public issue of social structure. So for Mills then, he said, public issues of social structure require us to use a broader perspective than personal troubles. So that broader perspective, he says, involves the intersection of personal biography, history, and society. So with this intersection of personal biography, history, and society, it means then adopting a wider, broader, more comprehensive framework. So one of the frameworks that one could use. So Mills then also puts together an assembly of articles called Images of Man, the History of Classical Sociological Thinking. And in this, he puts together several classical authors. So what is a classical author? Well, a classical author is someone who has analyzed the world, and you can think of, Plato, Aristotle, or Kant, Hegel as being classical thinkers, but Marx also would be a classical thinker. So they are individuals who have analyzed the world and tried to discover its great complexity and then make that complexity come to life so that we can understand it. It means really using the intersection of personal biography, history, and social structure. And so to understand the dynamics of social structure now is a much more complex task than kind of our everyday experiences ever lead us to do. So hopefully the opportunities for higher education, radio shows such as this, things like public broadcasting, all encourage individuals to think outside of their personal troubles, to think of, I need to locate my personal trouble within a particular social structure, understand what that social structure looks like, and then put that social structure into its historical context. And on the basis of that, I would have a more sophisticated way of trying to understand how we need to change the world to solve some of what seem to be personal troubles, but really are public issues of social structure.
Okay, so according to that, then, when I, as a member of this world, as a member of the human species, in this civilization, what do I see going on around me? And how do I understand it in these terms? Okay,
so I think the first thing is, which I've already mentioned, and that is really the growing consolidation of powerful transnational corporations. Right. So something like Facebook. Facebook, was a scheme dreamed up in a dorm room at Harvard University when 15 years ago, probably. Yeah. And now it is, one of the largest corporations in the world. So it has enormous economic power and therefore enormous political power. But, Facebook isn't the only centralized corporation like that. But we have, we in our regular everyday lives, we use Amazon to buy things. We go to Lowe's. But we never stop to think, well, what are the implications of profit generation going to these large, growing, Walmart will be another example, corporations that are, consumers all across Western Europe are also buying goods from them. So, we have no idea that we are really feeding a beast that is interested in its own self-preservation and not necessarily so interested in our, our welfare.
And would you say that these corporations now, more so than they were before, are harder to compete with, harder to dismantle, and more powerful than they've ever been before? In other words, that the world in 2018 looks fundamentally different from, say, the one in 1998 or 78 or 58.
Yeah, I think that that's true. That the major corporations that exist now are so large and have so much leverage that they would be way, way harder to dismantle or to bring into accountability, given the direction that governments are following right now. There doesn't seem to be enough of, even if in the, these midterm elections, the Democrats were able to take over the House and the Senate, the Democratic Party is not going to start moving towards dismantling any of these large corporations. They may pass legislation that will help favor, the everyday American a little bit more than is the circumstance now. But the idea of making dramatic social change, I don't think is on the political agenda of them, the Liberal government here nationally or provincially, and we certainly know it's not on the agenda of the Conservative government.
So in fact, there's a consensus almost across all parties that the way things are, just in terms of corporations, are pretty much going to remain the same. There are very few people who are arguing to dismantle them, at least in the mainstream political discourse.
Yeah.
And is that standard? I mean, Noam Chomsky has talked about that a lot before massive innovation in the last 20 years or so, that the mainstream opinions essentially don't take into account those who are arguing that the whole system is problematic in terms of corporations and capital and the raising of money. So if we add Marx to this whole pot, if you will, do we see behind this? Do we see something else going on?
Okay, that's a good question. Insofar as if we add Marx, Marx's analyses are detailed and complex. And there aren't very many people who are willing to sort of sit down and go through, the detail and the complexity of it. So it needs to be popularized to a certain extent. And in that process of popularization, that then might make more people aware that, oh, wow, there is a different discourse out there that has been shunted aside given the history of the Soviet Union, but it's a discourse that perhaps I should pay some attention to. The problem is that now with digital media, as people are pointing out, that there are so many independent right-wing media organizations that are able to proliferate and disseminate fake news that follows the position of Donald Trump as though it was real news. That you have one very loud voice competing with a number of not nearly as vocal voices, and so at this point in time, the radical right seems to be in a position where it's able to perpetuate its message much more effectively than the left has been able to do.
And why do you think that is? Like, what are the structural reasons for that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess a couple of structural reasons might be, number one, the mainstream media are small L liberal, not particularly far left. So they're willing to entertain and willing to underline all the different inconsistencies within the right discourse, but not willing to move further left than that. And so in terms of mainstream media, I don't think that there is a champion for a more radical discourse. And then in terms of, sort of digital media, I'm not sure why, but it seems that the right-wing discourses, perhaps because of the amount of funds that are behind things like Fox News and its alternatives, are much more massive than, who is it that you would fund a radical left-wing television network or internet networks. All of those things seem to me to be just sort of grown out of, they're like little cottage industries. So it's like cottage industries trying to compete against, a monolithic multinational corporation.
And even if you have multiple of these corporations, they all seem to be serving a similar interest, which is obviously to maximize their profit, but also to protect themselves from, say, an insurrection or some kind of uprising that would dismantle everything that's given them the resources they have. And when I say them, I'm not just referring to the corporations, but of course the owners of those corporations, which, to go back to Marxist terms, it's really the owners that define the class. The people who own the means of production. Is that even still an appropriate way to look at it, to divide people between the owners and the non-owners, or have things become a little bit more mushy recently?
Yeah, so on the one hand, they have become a little bit more mushy in that, ownership is not always easily identified with, Mark Zuckerberg or a particular individual. Nevertheless, and again, reading the classics is very instructive. So when Berlin Means write their book on the Managerial Revolution, when you read that book, what you find is they're talking about the emergence of large corporations. Okay, so, and they're talking about really the emergence of large corporations playing the role of the state, like acting in a state-like manner. They become almost like the growth of a religious entity. That much power. So they have the power in capitalism that religion had in feudal society. Then they say, so there are three possible scenarios that emerge out of this. So this is where most people haven't read the original. So the third scenario is the one that most people adopt. That what they're arguing is that when you have CEOs, that those CEOs, those board of directors, then appoint managers, and managers will then manage the corporation in the interests of the community as a whole. That was their third scenario. The first scenario was that the shareholders would require that the corporation operate the way it's supposed to, and that is only in their best interests. And that sort of seems to be the way our corporate structure is operating now, that the shareholders are being benefited extremely well. The second scenario was that the chief executive officers and the boards of directors and managers would operate the corporation not in the interests of the shareholders only, but in their own particular interest. So that would be the managerial revolution, where executive officers and managers, become incredibly wealthy. And maybe that's sort of where we're at. But we're certainly not at a position, I don't think, where chief executive officers and boards of directors and senior management is operating their corporations in ways that benefit all of humankind.
Well, and there's nothing in their constitutional makeup, so to speak, that would force them to do that. I mean, the only thing they have to do is to maximize profit and to make sure that they're not losing money, they're not going into the red. I remember a film I saw a long time ago that is probably quite outdated now, but had a big influence on me at the time, which was The Corporation, the documentary,
yes, yep.
which for the first time revealed to me that corporations are legally treated as persons, as legal persons. And it's a critical feature of our world today that these major, whether it's Facebook, Apple, Google, or Dell, I can't even think of old school companies like General Motors anymore, but that these companies are acting as people, as persons in our society, and are given the legal rights and responsibilities of a person, which is all the more scary if you think about the rise of artificial intelligence and how these things may actually become just like people, acting on their own behalf with some sort of their own volition.
Yeah, or that, and again, I'm not sure how algorithmic things operate, but the algorithms that are being developed by these multinational corporations to encourage us to consume, those algorithms are being designed and developed by people who are part of a chain of command in order to increase consumption, increase wealth accumulation for the chief executive officers and senior managers. So, I think there are individuals that are guiding the artificial intelligence, but they're guiding it in a way that fits in with the demands of the corporation, which in a way is what Marx was trying to get across back in his 3 volumes of Capital, that it's not that the capitalist is a bad person, it's just that within this particular structure where the investment of capital needs to lead to profit accumulation, and in order to maintain your existence, you need to be able to outcompete your competitors. That's the dynamic, and that dynamic still exists.
I think that's a great place to leave it, unfortunately, because this has been a fascinating conversation. And once again, I have 1,000 more questions I'd love to ask, but we have to call it quits. So, Professor Beamish, thanks so much for coming on.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it immensely.
All right. That is our show. Thank you for listening to What on Earth is Going On. We broadcast to you every Thursday at 6 p.m. on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston. Remember that all episodes are also available as a podcast, which can be accessed through your podcast provider, such as iTunes. Or you can find episodes and much more on the website www.wogoshow.com. That's www.WOEGOshow.com. I would love to get your feedback, your questions, and your suggestions, but as usual, I hope that you will keep this conversation going. Now, your quote of the week could easily be seen from a Marxist perspective of constant disruption and agitation. It's from a Globe and Mail column by Lawrence Martin earlier this month. Here goes. The unemployment rate in the United States fell to a paltry 3.9% last month. That is big news. To find an American rate lower than today's, you have to go back half a century to the late 1960s. The slight attention paid to these employment numbers is an illustration of how the country's image is being excessively Trump-framed. We in the media are consumed by his every utterance. No president has sucked the oxygen out of every room like this one. He has the news cycle by the throat. Big domestic stories are lost in the daily anarchy, the shattering of the norms, the circus never leaving town." Close quote. See you next week. Thanks for listening. Good night. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, visit wogoshow.com, that's WOEGO show.com, or search for What on Earth is Going On in your podcast provider. See you next time.